this is Lauren from the Otto Bruins Public Library of Northfield. Today I'm going to share a very simple recipe to make biscuits. The biscuits I make are going to be vegan, but yours certainly don't have to be. I'm simply using soy milk and a non-dairy butter substitute because I'm allergic to dairy. But if you would like, you can certainly use buttermilk and dairy butter instead. You'll simply exclude one other ingredient that I'll get to in a second. First things first, my oven is preheating to 450 degrees. And like I said, if you're making a non-vegan recipe, you're just going to use 1 cup of buttermilk. But since this is a vegan recipe, I'm using 1 cup of soy milk, and I'm going to add a tablespoon of lemon juice. And just let that sit for maybe 5 minutes. What that'll do is the lemon juice will give the soy milk the texture of a similar texture to regular buttermilk. While that sits, we'll take a big old bowl, 2 cups of flour. All-purpose flour is your best shot here. I have 2 teaspoons of baking powder, a ½ teaspoon baking soda, and 3/4 salt that I'm going to add. Now I'm using 3/4 teaspoon of salt because my butter substitute is already salted. If you're using unsalted butter, you might want to increase that just to 1 whole teaspoon of salt. So give that a good mix. The next step is to add your vegan butter substitute or your normal dairy butter. Now, a lot of baking recipes will call for you to use softened butter, but in this case you want to use really cold butter, like right out of the fridge. That's going to help achieve the flakiness of a biscuit that we want. And we want to make about pea-sized pieces of the flour and the butter. First things first, you can toss it a little to coat the butter and the flour. It's just going to make things easier for you. And there's a couple ways you can do this. I have a pastry cutter, which you can just go right in there and cut the butter into the flour. But I know a lot of people don't have this. Another way is to use 2 knives and cut the butter into the flour, similar to the pastry cutter. Or the simplest way is to just use your hands, which is what I'm going to do. It's a little messier, but your hands are probably your best tool. So like I said, these pieces of cold butter are what are going to make the biscuits nice and flaky. So you don't want to completely mix them into the flour. You want to keep some whole butter pieces. You can see it's like around the size of a pea. That's what you're going for. I'm making a little well in the middle for the liquid. And now let's take a look at this vegan quote-unquote buttermilk we made. When I pour it in, you'll see that it's gotten a little bit thicker. The texture of the milk has changed. Alright, now we're going to gently mix this all together until it's just incorporated. That's my oven preheating. The thing with biscuit dough is you want to have an extremely light touch. It's not bread. We're not going to be kneading it. So when you knead a dough, that's what makes it chewier and tougher, which is the opposite of what we want in this case. We want a very delicate biscuit. Mine's feeling pretty wet. I'm going to add a little more flour, which is totally fine to do. I have maybe a tablespoon in my hand. It will be sticky, but it should also be handleable, if that makes sense. All right. Gonna give my surface a good flouring. flour up your hands. Then we're going to turn out the dough. Now, this is a really basic biscuit dough. Once you get this down, you can certainly add more flavors. You can add cheese in with the butter, like cheddar. You can add some jalapenos. There's a lot of room for experimenting. All right, like I said, we're not kneading this. We're just making sure that the dough all comes together. And we want to pat this down just with our hands. You don't need a rolling pin, to about 1 inch thickness. This is about 4 by 8, just a rough estimate. You can use a ruler if that makes you happy. Taking the short end of the dough, if you can see, this is the longer end, this is the short end. I'm gonna fold it over itself like a letter. And pat it back down to that same 1 inch thickness, 4 inches by 8 inches. This might seem a little weird, but we're encouraging the dough to make layers. So when you bake it, you'll have all those delicious, flaky biscuit layers that everyone loves. All right, so we folded it over twice. Like I said, very light touch. We really want to handle it as little as possible. Now you could cut out round biscuits. You could you have a circle cutter, or you can use a glass. But what I'm going to do is just make square biscuits. It's a little less fussy and you don't have to deal with scrap dough. I'm just going to make about 8 biscuits, so I'm kind of right down the middle. Your knife might need a little flour. Alright, so I transferred all the biscuits onto my baking sheet. Like I said, your oven should be preheated to around 450 degrees. All that's left to do is brush the top with some melted butter. Again, I'm using a vegan butter substitute. I use the brand Earth Balance, but of course plain old dairy butter will work just fine now. I'm using a pastry brush. It's probably the easiest way to do it. This will give them a nice brown top. Now all that's left is to bake them, 450 degree oven, for 10 to 15 minutes. Everyone's oven is different, so I would recommend starting with 10 minutes and then adding more time if it needs it. Alright, mine ended up being in the oven about 14 minutes. They puffed up a lot, which is exactly what we're looking for. There's going to be lots of great layers in there. It's lightly brown on top and it has a strong brown color on the bottom. Now it's a good idea to let these cool down maybe 5 minutes, but they really are best out of the oven fresh that same day. They will keep for maybe 2 or 3 days. Pretty good if you stick them in the toaster the next day, but I would recommend eating them as soon as possible. Alright, that's all it takes to make really easy biscuits at home. They turned out delicate, there's layers, they're fluffy and delicious. I really hope you try this out yourself and let us know what you think.